Get comfortable, turn the lights down if you haven't already. Tonight isn't about a mystery or a theory or a character's tragic backstory, even though all of that is still down there, waiting, the way it always is with this show. Tonight is about something simpler and somehow harder to pin down. Why does Adventure Time feel the way it feels? Why is it, out of every cartoon made in the last 20 years, the one that so many people reach for, specifically when they cannot sleep? Not when they want to laugh, not when they want a thrill, but when their mind is too loud and they need something to sit beside them in the dark until it quiets down. That is a very specific kind of trust to place in a television show, and it is not an accident that Adventure Time earns it. Nothing about comfort this reliable is an accident. It is built, piece by piece, out of decisions that most viewers never consciously notice, and tonight we are going to go looking for those decisions, one at a time, until the shape of the whole thing comes into focus. There is a way people usually talk about why a show is comforting, and it mostly amounts to a shrug, a small, well-meaning gesture toward a feeling nobody bothers to actually open up and look inside of. They say it's nostalgic. They say it reminds them of being a kid. They say the colors are nice. All of that is true, and none of it is specific enough to actually explain anything, because plenty of nostalgic, colorful, kid-adjacent shows do not get put on at 1 a.m. by adults who are, by any reasonable measure, too old for it. Something else, something more specific and more traceable is happening. Something in the actual construction of the thing, the sound design, the pacing, the choice of colors, the way the actors were allowed to work, the literal shape of an 11-minute episode is doing work that most comfort media doesn't bother doing or doesn't know how to do. We're going to take it apart tonight, the way you'd take apart a favorite chair to figure out why it's the one you always end up sitting in. Not to ruin it, and not to strip the magic out of something that has earned the right to feel a little magical. Just to understand it well enough to be even more at ease in it afterward, the way understanding a friend better usually deepens the comfort of their company rather than dissolving it. Let's start at the very edge of the show, right at its border, before a single frame of ooh appears on screen, with the 30 seconds of sound that plays over the opening titles of every single episode the series ever aired. The Adventure Time theme song is a strange little artifact if you actually stop and listen to it as sound rather than as a signal that says the show is starting. It's short. It's recorded on a ukulele. The vocal is close and dry, almost too close, the kind of recording you get when someone is sitting a few feet from a cheap microphone in a small room rather than performing in a proper booth with proper distance and proper treatment on the walls. And if you listen closely, especially with headphones, especially in a quiet room like the one you might be in right now, you can hear something underneath the music that has nothing to do with the music at all. A faint, rhythmic clicking, someone typing. According to creator Pendleton Ward's own account of how the track came to exist, that recording was never meant to be final. It was a temp track, a rough placeholder made quickly in the animatics room on what Ward has described as a cheap little microphone, intended only to be dropped into the titles long enough to submit the pilot to the network. The plan, as plans like this usually go, was to redo it properly later with better equipment, in a cleaner room, with a take that didn't have another crew member's keyboard bleeding into the mix. They did redo it, and Ward didn't like the redo. He has said plainly that he only liked the temp one, the imperfect one, the one with the typing in it. And so that is the version that ended up airing at the start of every episode of the show's entire run. The sound of someone else working in the background, audible testify the whole enterprise had actually happened around a small group of people in a room together, was not removed. It was kept on purpose because removing it would have meant losing something the polished version didn't have. That single decision tells you almost everything you need to know about why this show feels the way it feels, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we move anywhere else. A completely clean recording would have been objectively more professional. It would have sounded more like the theme song of a well-funded children's program, more like something engineered rather than something that simply happened, and it would have been worse. Not technically worse, emotionally worse, because the specific comfort Adventure Time produces depends, from its very first second, on sounding like something made by human hands in an actual room rather than something manufactured to spec. The typing you can hear is not a flaw the show forgot to fix. It's evidence. It's the audio equivalent of a fingerprint left in wet paint, proof that a person was standing right there when this thing was made, close enough that you can hear them breathing, close enough that their unrelated ordinary task leaked into the recording of something that would end up meaning a great deal to a great many people. There's a reason this matters to a nervous system trying to relax. Polish signals performance, grain signals presence, and presence, oddly enough, is one of the load-bearing pillars of comfort. A completely frictionless, seamless piece of media can feel like it's addressing an audience. A slightly imperfect one, with the seams still visible if you look, can feel like it's letting you into a room rather than performing for you from a stage. Adventure Time chose, from the very first 30 seconds, to let you into the room. Composer Tim Kiefer and his collaborator Casey James Basikis, who scored the vast majority of the show's music across its 10-season run, have talked about wanting the score itself to carry a similar texture, describing an aesthetic built around what they called hiss and grit rather than clean digital polish, an intentional roughness running underneath cues that could otherwise have been slick and characterless. The typing under the theme song wasn't an isolated accident. It was the loudest, most literal expression of a philosophy that ran through the entire sound of the show. Keep the grain. Let people hear that other people made this. That's a small thing to start with, admittedly. A few seconds of background noise under a ukulele. But comfort is almost never built out of one grand gesture. It's built out of dozens of small, consistent choices that added together produce a feeling nobody can quite point to the source of. So let's keep going, because the next layer down is bigger, and it has to do with something most people watching this show have never once thought to question. Why does each episode only last 11 minutes? There's a good, boring, industry answer to that question, which is that 11 minutes is a standard half-hour block minus commercials and a lead-in, the kind of format Cartoon Network and its competitors used across a whole generation of shows to fit 2 episodes into a 30-minute slot. That's the practical business reason the format exists at all, and it's worth being honest that Adventure Time didn't invent the 11-minute cartoon. It inherited the container. But what Adventure Time did with that container, and why that container ends up mattering so much to the specific kind of viewer who watches this show to fall asleep, is a separate and more interesting question. An 11-minute story has almost no room for the kind of open-ended dread that longer serialized television specializes in. It can not leave you hanging on a cliffhanger for 6 days the way a prestige drama can, because by the design of its format, it has to resolve, or at least land somewhere stable, before the next segment starts. There is a kind of viewer, and if you are watching this at night with the lights off, you are very possibly that kind of viewer, for whom the promise of resolution within a short, known window is itself a source of calm. You are never more than a few minutes away from the story settling down. The threat, whatever it happens to be that episode, a giant snail wrecking the tree fort, a cursed video game, a wizard who's turned himself into a pile of shifting shapes, will almost always be handled, contained, laughed off, or otherwise put back in its box before the credits roll. Nothing is going to be left open and screaming in the dark for you to worry about across an entire week. There's a piece of undergraduate research on the show written by a student named Rachel Nettles and later circulated as an example of accessible academic writing about children's media that puts a name to exactly this quality. Nettles argues that even though Adventure Time contains moments that are intense, moments where a beloved character is genuinely in peril, the show almost never produces real anxiety in its audience, because underneath every conflict sits an assumed, dependable moral order. Even flawed, even frightening characters are shown to contain some capacity for good, and the good eventually wins out. That's a specific and useful way to describe what a lot of people experience only as a vague feeling of safety while watching. It isn't that nothing bad ever happens in the land of Ooh. Plenty happens. People lose limbs, lose their minds, lose each other for 1,000 years at a stretch. It's that the show has trained you, episode after episode, to trust the machinery underneath the plot, even when the plot itself gets scary, the way you'd trust a roller coaster you've ridden 100 times, even on the drop, that still makes your stomach flip. The thrill is allowed to be real because the safety net underneath it has already proven over and over that it's real too. You can feel this most clearly in the show's quieter episodes, the ones that don't even bother with a threat at all. In the 4th season, an episode called 5 Short Graybles abandons plot entirely and instead follows 5 different characters through 5 small, disconnected, almost plotless slices of an ordinary morning, cutting between them the way you might glance around a neighborhood on a slow Sunday. Nothing is at stake. Nobody is in danger. It's just people existing in small domestic moments, and the show trusts that watching people simply exist inside a world you already love is, on its own, worth 11 minutes of your attention. An episode like that could not exist inside a show that needed constant tension to hold an audience. It exists here specifically because the show has already established, through its overall pattern, that you don't need to be worried in order to stay interested. You can just be present. That's an unusual thing to offer a viewer, and it's an even more unusual thing to offer specifically to the kind of viewer who has spent all day being tense about things that are not cartoons and who needs, more than anything else at 11 at night, a place where nothing is required of their nervous system except attention. Go ahead and drop a comment down below telling me where you're watching from tonight and what time it is there right now. I like knowing that people all over the world end up in the same dark, quiet place, even when it's a completely different hour for each of them. Sometimes it's late where you are, and early where someone else reading the same comment section happens to be. And there's something oddly grounding about that mismatch, a whole scattered map of insomnia and unwinding and ordinary tiredness, all of it pointed for a few minutes at the same small patch of light. Let's go a little deeper into the part of the show that isn't sound and isn't structure, but is the first thing your eyes actually register the moment an episode begins: the color and the texture of the world itself. Adventure Time doesn't look like most of the animation surrounding it, and the specific way it doesn't look like its neighbors is worth being precise about, because the difference isn't just more colorful. A lot of children's animation from the same era relies on flat, vector-based backgrounds, clean geometric shapes, filled with a single uniform color, the kind of look that's cheap to produce and reads clearly on a small screen, but tends to feel a little sterile, a little like a diagram of a place rather than a place. Adventure Time's backgrounds, especially in its earlier and middle seasons under art director Nick Jennings, were built to feel painted rather than drawn, with visible texture, layered color, and a sense of depth and light that owed more to traditional landscape painting and fantasy illustration than to standard television production shortcuts. Jennings came to the show already carrying a long history in exactly this kind of work, having done color and layout work on Hanna-Barbera's A Pup Named Scooby-Doo in the late 1980s, and having helped shape the visual identity of Nickelodeon's Rocko's Modern Life before co-developing SpongeBob SquarePants with Steven Hillenburg. By the time he arrived on Adventure Time, he brought with him a specific instinct for making animated worlds feel inhabited, dimensional, and a little bit soft at the edges, working alongside background designers like the artist known as Ghost Shrimp and Santino Lascano, and painters including Sue Montt and Martin Ansola Bahir, whose combined work gave the Land of Ooh its particular quality of looking hand-painted even when it was being produced at the volume and speed a weekly television schedule demands. That texture matters more than it might seem to, because the human eye and the human nervous system respond differently to flat, uniform color than they do to color with visible variation, gradient, and grain. A flat blue sky reads as information: sky, daytime, nothing more to notice. A painted sky with soft transitions between shades, faint visible brushwork, small imperfections in the gradient, reads as atmosphere, as weather, almost as a mood you could stand inside. The land of Ooh, drenched as it is in candy pinks and grass greens and the deep, saturated blue of Marceline's cave, was built by people whose entire visual training was in making a place feel real enough to want to be in, rather than merely legible enough to explain itself in 11 minutes. And crucially, all of that painterly softness never tips over into anything harsh. The palette of Adventure Time avoids, almost entirely, the kind of high contrast, aggressive color combinations that read as alarm to the eye. No sirens of red against black, no acid greens paired with violent purples in the way horror or action media often uses color specifically to keep a viewer's adrenaline up. Even the show's villains tend to live inside color palettes that are unsettling rather than aggressive, the pale, sickly whites and grays of the Lich, rather than anything that would spike a viewer's stress response the way certain color combinations are known to. The whole show, visually, sits inside a comparatively narrow, warm, saturated but non-alarming range, and that range is a big part of why it functions so well as something to have playing while your body is trying to wind down for sleep. Your eyes are never asked to brace. There's a particular kind of comfort, too, in a world that so obviously took the time to be beautiful without being asked to be, in places nobody was necessarily going to linger on. Background details, the shape of a distant mountain, the specific way moss grows on a ruined wall, the pattern of clouds in a sky that only exists for a few seconds before the scene cuts away, were rendered with the same painterly care as the characters standing in the foreground. That kind of care, invisible as it mostly is to a conscious viewer scrolling through an episode looking for the next joke or the next plot beat, has a way of registering anyway, quietly, underneath conscious notice, the same way a well-tended garden feels different to walk through than a neglected one, even if you couldn't say exactly why. Something in you clocks that this space was made with attention, and something in you settles slightly in response, the way you settle when you walk into someone's home and notice, without quite noticing that you've noticed, that things have been placed with intention rather than left wherever they landed, a lived-in kind of order that no amount of expensive furniture can fully substitute for if the intention behind the arrangement was never actually there. The music underneath all of that visual softness was built with an almost identical philosophy, just translated into sound instead of color. Casey James Basikas and Tim Kiefer, the show's primary composers across the vast majority of its run, met at the California Institute of the Arts, the same school that produced series creator Pendleton Ward, and their history together predates the show by years. Before Adventure Time, the two of them performed as a lo-fi duo called Casey James and the Stay Puft Kid, self-releasing albums and, in Kiefer's own description, crashing the Southern California music scene around 2007 as what he's called the world's foremost Game Boy ukulele duo, an image that tells you almost everything about the specific, unpretentious, homemade sensibility they brought with them into professional scoring work. Basikas has described the earliest creative direction he was given for the show's music as intentionally open, and has talked about wanting the score to carry what he called an atmosphere gripped with juvenile silliness and unbiased curiosity, meant to evoke the particular feeling of being at a point in life when everything is still new. That is, when you think about it for a moment, a remarkably specific goal for a piece of background music to be chasing, and it is not the same goal as simply writing pleasant filler to sit under dialogue. It is music trying to recreate a psychological state, the openness and unguardedness of early childhood curiosity, using chiptune textures, hand percussion, beatboxing, and the same kind of deliberately lo-fi, slightly grainy production choices that show up everywhere else in the show's sound design. The score doesn't sit quietly underneath the picture the way a lot of television scoring is trained to. Basikis has described it as intentionally injecting itself into scenes rather than staying subordinate to them, nudging the emotional temperature of a moment rather than simply decorating it. And because so much of it draws from genuinely warm, playful, almost toy-like instrumentation, chiptune bleeps, the particular plastic clatter of a Game Boy sound chip, hand-played ukulele, the music ends up doing quietly for your ears what the painted backgrounds do for your eyes, softening every edge, keeping the emotional temperature warm even when the story on screen has wandered somewhere darker. And then there's the singing, which is its own separate layer of intimacy, because unlike a lot of animated shows that bring in professional singers to record a character's musical numbers, Adventure Time relied heavily on its actual voice cast to perform their characters' songs themselves. Jeremy Shada sang as Finn. Olivia Olson, whose own real musical background gave her performances as Marceline a specific lived-in vocal quality, sang as Marceline. Tom Kenny sang as the Ice King. When Marceline sits in her cave in the 4th season episode, I Remember You, and sings Simon's old apologetic notes back to him in his own words, that voice belongs to the same actor who plays Marceline in every other scene of the show, not a separate vocalist brought in to hit the notes more cleanly. The show chose an intimacy over polish there too, the same choice it made with the theme song, and the same choice its composer picked with the score, and the cumulative effect of all these small choices, stacked on top of each other across 10 seasons, is a show that never once sounds like it was made at arm's length from its own emotions. That intimacy extended into how the actual recording sessions were run, which brings us to a layer of the show's comfort that almost nobody talks about, because it has nothing to do with anything you can see on screen. It has to do with the room the voices were recorded in, and who was standing in it together. A great deal of American animation, especially by the time you get into the 2010, and certainly by now, records its voice actors separately, each performer alone in a booth on their own schedule, their lines stitched together afterward by editors who never had the actors in the same physical space at the same time. It's efficient. It's also, by most actors' own accounts, a lonelier and less alive way to work, because you lose the ability to actually play off another person's timing, their breath, the specific way they land a joke in real time. Adventure Time, by multiple first-hand accounts from its own cast, worked differently for most of its run. Jeremy Shada, who began voicing Finn at 12 years old and grew into adulthood across the show's 10 seasons, has described the show's recording sessions as ensemble-based whenever possible, with himself, John DiMaggio as Jake, Hynden Walsh as Princess Bubblegum, and Tom Kenny as the Ice King, frequently in the booth together rather than recording alone, departing from that setup only when scheduling conflicts or geography genuinely required it. That arrangement let the cast build real chemistry over years of shared work, chemistry that shows up on screen as the specific, easy, lived-in warmth between Finn and Jake, the two characters at the emotional center of the entire show. And that warmth, it turns out, was not manufactured. It was closer to reportage. You can hear the depth of what those years actually meant to the people involved in the way the show's ending affected them. John DiMaggio, who voiced Jake for the entirety of the show's run and later returned to voice him again in the prequel spin-off Adventure Time, Side Quests, has spoken publicly and repeatedly about how emotional the end of the original series was for him, describing weeping after his final recording session for the show's finale, and later, when discussing his return to the role years afterward, saying plainly that after the last recording for the original series, he got in his car, started driving, and began crying uncontrollably. That is not, by any reasonable measure, the kind of reaction an actor tends to have toward a job that felt like just a job, something clocked in, and out of, forgotten the moment the paycheck clears. That is the reaction of someone who spent close to a decade on a regular basis sitting in a room with people he had genuinely come to care about, playing a character who was, in the show's own internal logic, defined almost entirely by his capacity for uncomplicated love and loyalty toward the people around him. The performance and the person performing it were not, by DiMaggio's own account, very far apart. And audiences, whether or not they could ever articulate why, tend to feel the difference between a performance built on real affection between collaborators and one built purely on professional competence. Something in the timing, the overlap, the specific way one actor's line seems to actually respond to another actor's delivery, rather than simply following a script cue, carries information that a listener absorbs below the level of conscious analysis. You were for years listening to people who liked each other play characters who liked each other in a room together. That is a rarer thing in television production than most viewers realize, and it is very possibly one of the least visible, most structurally important reasons the show feels like a place rather than a product. Let's move now toward the world itself, toward the actual geography and architecture of comfort inside the show, because there's a specific, recurring visual and narrative rhythm running through Adventure Time that almost every episode obeys, whether or not the story ever draws attention to it. You leave the tree fort, and you come back to the tree fort. Home base as a structural device is not unique to this show. Plenty of adventure fiction, going back long before television existed, works on a rhythm of departure and return, a hero's journey model where a protagonist leaves ordinary life, undergoes some trial, and comes home changed. But there's something specifically soothing about the particular version of that rhythm Adventure Time runs, because the home in question, the tree fort Finn and Jake share, rarely changes in any fundamental way between adventures. The furniture stays roughly where it was. The bunk beds are still there. BMO is still there, plugged in, present, unbothered by whatever apocalyptic scale danger the boys just survived somewhere out in the world. However strange, however dark, however genuinely frightening a given episode's threat becomes, and some of them do get genuinely dark, there is almost always, by the end, a return to this same small, known, physically consistent space, populated by the same handful of familiar presences. That predictability of return is doing real psychological work on a viewer, especially a tired one. You are never asked to wonder whether home will still be there. It always is. The show never punishes you for trusting that the tree fort will still be standing at the end of the episode, the way it was standing at the beginning, and across 10 seasons and hundreds of episodes, that trust compounds. By the time you're a few seasons in, some part of you isn't even consciously tracking the reassurance anymore. It's just there, structurally, underneath everything else, the way the floor of a house is there, even when you're not thinking about the floor. That home is also, notably, not built around a traditional family structure, and the specific shape it takes instead is worth naming plainly, because it's one of the most consistently cited reasons audiences of all kinds report feeling emotionally at home inside this particular fictional world. Finn and Jake are brothers by choice and by circumstance rather than by blood, raised together by Jake's parents after Finn was found as an infant. BMO lives with them as something between a sibling, a pet, and, as the show itself frames it more than once, something closer to a parent figure in certain small domestic moments, despite technically being a video game console. The found family trope, as it's usually called in discussions of fiction, tends to resonate specifically because it speaks to something close to universal in human experience. Not everyone grows up with a biological family structure that felt safe or sufficient, and stories that show characters building their own version of home out of chosen bonds rather than inherited ones offer a particular kind of hope. The reassurance that belonging is something you can build rather than something you either received at birth or didn't. Adventure Time builds an entire ensemble on top of that premise. Marceline's closest kinship is with people she chose to stay near across 1,000 years rather than with the family that she was born into. Princess Bubblegum surrounds herself with a kingdom of beings she quite literally created out of some deep, unspoken need to have something to be responsible for. Even the show's villains tend to get folded eventually into some version of belonging. By the time the series ends, former antagonists are sitting at the same tables, invited to the same celebrations, absorbed into the same wide, loose, forgiving definition of family the show has been building the entire time. There is comfort simply in watching a fictional world model over and over the idea that you are allowed to build the people around you into a family, that the door is never permanently closed, that even someone who caused harm can eventually be let back in if the harm gets acknowledged and enough time and care goes into repairing it. Now, it would be dishonest to sit here tonight and pretend the show achieves all of this softness by simply avoiding anything difficult because it doesn't. Adventure Time is famously, and by now fairly well documented, built on top of a buried catastrophe, a post-apocalyptic setting seeded almost by accident in its early seasons when an eighth episode joke about businessmen frozen in an iceberg quietly implied, for the first time, that the candy-colored world of Ooh had grown up over the wreckage of something that looked a great deal like our own civilization. That detail, and the 1,000 years of history built outward from it across the show's later seasons, has been covered elsewhere and covered thoroughly, so we won't dwell on the mechanics of it again tonight. What's worth noticing instead, for our specific purposes right now, is how the show chooses to hold that darkness once it exists, because the holding matters just as much as the existence. Adventure Time never uses its post-apocalyptic backstory as a source of ongoing dread. It doesn't build tension by making you worry the ruins will swallow the candy back up. It treats the darkness as sediment, as something that has already happened and already been survived, rather than as a threat still actively unfolding. The businessmen in the iceberg are strange and a little sad, but they are also, within the scene itself, treated as a mild comic beat. Confused men in suits blinking at a world that no longer makes sense to them, rather than as a horror reveal designed to spike anyone's pulse. The show consistently frames its saddest, heaviest material at a slight emotional distance, softened by tone, by pacing, by the reliable presence of characters you already trust to get through it. Grief in this show almost always arrives already metabolized, already survived by someone, rather than raw and unresolved in the moment you're watching it. Simon Petrikov's transformation into the Ice King is unbearably sad in outline, and the show knows it, and still chooses again and again to deliver that sadness through the register of gentle tragedy rather than active terror, through quiet VHS recordings and old apologetic notes rather than through anything designed to make your body brace. That distinction between darkness that is still actively threatening you and darkness that has already happened and is simply being witnessed with tenderness turns out to matter enormously for whether a piece of media can function as something to fall asleep to. A threat still unfolding keeps your nervous system in a state of low-grade readiness, waiting to see what happens next, which is precisely the opposite of what you want your body doing at midnight. Grief already survived, already sitting quietly in the past tense, asks something different of you. It asks you to witness, to feel something real, even something sad, but from a position of safety rather than suspense, the way you might feel something real and sad looking at an old photograph rather than watching a crisis happen live. Adventure Time, again and again, chooses the photograph. Even its most devastating reveals, the video diaries in Holly Jolly Secrets, Marceline singing Simon's old letters back to him in I Remember You, tend to be delivered through artifacts of the past, tapes, notes, memories, rather than through moment-to-moment danger. You're being shown something that already happened and has already, in some sense, been survived by the very fact that a character is now old enough, or lucid enough, or safe enough to be showing it to you. That structural choice, more than almost any other single element of the show, is probably why so many people report being able to cry gently while watching certain Adventure Time episodes and still fall asleep comfortably 5 minutes later. The sadness is real. It's simply being held at the specific emotional temperature that allows a tired body to hold it too, rather than being flooded by it. There's another layer of comfort buried in the show that has nothing to do with story at all, and everything to do with time actually passing in the real world alongside the show's own internal timeline. And it's a layer that most long-running animated series simply cannot access, because most animated shows freeze their characters permanently at a single age. Adventure Time didn't. Jeremy Shada was 12 years old when he began voicing Finn in 2010, and the show ran until 2018, across which time Shada grew, in reality, from a child into a young adult, and rather than replacing him or artificially preserving a child's voice through vocal processing, the production simply let his voice change on screen the way it changed in life. Finn's voice gets audibly deeper across the show's run, not as a stylistic choice made by writers, but as an honest byproduct of an actual person growing up while playing him. Finn ages from a 12-year-old at the start of the series to a young man by its end, and the show incorporates that aging directly into the character's arc rather than concealing it, so that watching Adventure Time in order means, among everything else it means, watching a real childhood pass in real time, layered underneath a fictional one. For a certain kind of longtime viewer, especially anyone who started watching as a child themselves and has grown up alongside the show across the years since, that parallel growth produces a specific, quiet kind of comfort that has almost nothing to do with plot and everything to do with time. The show got older the way you got older. It didn't leave you behind, frozen at 11 years old forever, the way some childhood favorites can start to feel once you've outgrown them. It aged alongside you, which makes returning to it now, whatever age you happen to be tonight, feel less like visiting a museum of who you used to be, and more like checking in with an old friend who has, in their own way, kept pace with you the whole time. All of this, the grain in the audio, the painterly backgrounds, the warm chiptune scoring, the ensemble chemistry between actual friends recording in the same room, the reliable tree fort, the found family, the way grief gets delivered already survived rather than still unfolding, the way the show's own lead actor's voice deepened in real time, adds up to something that is worth naming directly, because it connects to research on comfort media that has nothing specifically to do with this show at all, and everything to do with how human minds process familiarity. Clinical psychologists and behavioral researchers who study why people rewatch old favorites rather than seeking out new content, especially during periods of stress, describe a consistent pattern. Familiar media reduces what researchers sometimes call cognitive load, the mental effort required to process new information, because you already know, on some level, how the story goes, who the characters are, and how things are likely to turn out. That reduced load frees up mental and emotional resources that would otherwise be spent bracing for the unknown, and that freed up capacity is a large part of why rewatching something familiar can feel like an active form of rest rather than merely a passive form of entertainment. One clinical psychologist quoted in coverage of this research described the underlying need plainly. Sometimes we need life to stay exactly the same for a few hours so that it can feel safe and stable. Adventure time, even the very first time a given viewer encounters it, is engineered through every choice we've spent tonight. Walking through to feel like it has already been safe and stable for a long time before you arrived. The way an old, well-worn path through a familiar forest feels safe even the first time you personally walk it, simply because everything about its construction signals that many feet have walked it calmly before yours. There's a particular irony worth sitting with here, which is that a show this widely, specifically used as sleep content, as background company for tired minds at the end of long days, was never designed with that function in mind. Nobody on the original production was building Adventure Time to be played quietly in the dark while someone drifted off. It was built, first, to be a genuinely inventive piece of children's television, full of jokes and adventure and a fair amount of chaos, made by a young, ambitious, largely CalArts-trained crew who were mostly just trying to make something they personally found funny and moving. And yet the specific choices that crew kept making, again and again, in ways that had nothing to do with any conscious plan to produce a soothing show, kept accumulating into exactly the kind of texture that soothing requires. The kept-in typing under the theme song wasn't there to help anyone sleep. It was there because Pendleton Ward liked the way it sounded better than the polished version. The painterly backgrounds weren't commissioned as a relaxation technique. They existed because Nick Jennings and his team had spent their careers learning how to make animated worlds feel physically real, and that was simply the visual language they knew how to build in. The ensemble recording sessions weren't scheduled with comfort in mind. They happened because the actors and producers found that recording together produced better, more alive performances. Comfort, in other words, wasn't ever the stated goal, wasn't written into any pitch document or production memo that anyone involved has ever mentioned. Comfort was the side effect of a whole production culture that consistently valued warmth, texture, presence, and genuine feeling over polish, efficiency, and attachment at every single level of the process, from the sound of a temp recording to the color of a background painting to the chemistry between actors in a booth, and side effects built from that many compounding layers of honest craftsmanship tend, it turns out, to be extremely durable. They don't wear off the way a manufactured, algorithmically optimized version of comfort tends to, because they were never engineered to trigger a specific response in the first place. They were simply, consistently, made with care by people who liked each other and liked what they were making, and something about that care survives the transfer from screen to viewer more or less intact, the way warmth survives being poured from one cup into another. If you want to feel that layered accumulation of small, honest choices most directly, watch, or simply remember, the way an ordinary, quiet scene unfolds in this show. Not a battle, not a reveal. Just Finn and Jake lying around the tree fort on an evening with nothing urgent happening, talking about nothing much, BMO nearby doing whatever small, odd thing BMO does when nobody's watching closely. The painted light outside the window is soft and a little grainy at the edges, the way real evening light is. The score underneath, if there's any score at all in that moment, is probably a slow, warm loop built out of a handful of gentle instruments, rather than anything designed to build tension. The actor's timing has the loose, easy overlap of two people who have spent years finishing each other's rhythms. And nothing, structurally, is asking anything of you as a viewer except to be present in the room with them for a few minutes. That is not spectacle. It was never going to trend online or get clipped for a highlight reel. But it is, very possibly, the truest expression of everything we've spent tonight taking apart, because it's the moment where every single one of those small, careful decisions, the sound, the color, the chemistry, the structural safety of home, stops being separate ingredients and simply becomes an atmosphere. A room you can sit in. A place that isn't asking you to feel anything specific, just letting you feel whatever you happen to be feeling, held gently by a world that was built, one small, honest choice at a time, to hold exactly that. There's a slightly different angle worth taking on all of this, one that has less to do with production choices and more to do with what the show is actually, at the level of theme, telling you about difficulty itself. Because comfort media that only ever shows you easy things eventually starts to feel thin, almost dishonest, in a way that undermines its own purpose. A world with no real difficulty in it doesn't feel safe. It feels false, and false safety doesn't actually calm a nervous system that has any real experience of the world. It just gets ignored, the way a smoke detector chirping constantly for no reason eventually gets its batteries pulled. Adventure Time avoids that trap almost entirely by refusing to pretend its world is free of real difficulty, while simultaneously refusing to let that difficulty curdle into despair. The show's characters lose things. Jake ages and, according to material released after the main series concluded, eventually dies, a fact the show handles not by hiding it, but by placing a small tattoo of Jake permanently on Finn's chest in later stories, visible whenever he's shown without a shirt, a piece of information the show trusts its audience to notice and sit with rather than spelling out directly. Marceline loses everyone she has ever known except one man who no longer remembers her. Princess Bubblegum loses a kingdom's trust and has to earn her way back through actual accountability rather than narrative convenience. None of that gets erased or softened into non-existence for the sake of keeping things pleasant. What gets softened instead is the delivery. The show's honest about loss while remaining gentle about how it delivers that honesty, and that specific combination, real difficulty delivered with real gentleness, is probably the single most sophisticated thing Adventure Time does as a piece of comfort media, because it manages to be genuinely true to the shape of an actual life, which does contain real loss, while still being safe enough to fall asleep to, which most honest accounts of loss are not. It threads a needle that a huge amount of comfort media doesn't even attempt. choosing instead to simply remove difficulty altogether and call the resulting blankness peaceful. Adventure Time never mistakes blankness for peace. It knows the difference, and it consistently chooses peace that has actually earned itself by getting honestly through something hard, rather than peace that was never tested against anything at all, the kind of hollow, untested calm that tends to crack the moment real difficulty finally shows up and asks something of it. That distinction shows up clearly if you think about the show's villains, almost none of whom remain simply, uncomplicatedly evil for very long. The Ice King begins the series as a genuinely irritating antagonist, a kidnapper of princesses played mostly for comic incompetence, and the show could have left him there for 10 seasons, and nobody would have complained. Instead, across Holly Jolly Secrets and every episode that follows it, the show slowly, deliberately dismantles the idea that he was ever simply a villain, revealing him instead as a man whose mind had been eaten away by a magical object he never fully understood while he was trying, in whatever broken way remained available to him, to protect the one person he loved most in a ruined world. The Lich, introduced as close to pure cosmic evil as this show ever gets, an entity whose entire purpose is the ending of all living things, is eventually transformed into a small, ordinary child named Sweet Pea, loved by a family, prone to nightmares his new parents sit with rather than dismiss. Even Orgalorg, an ancient cosmic being once known as the Breaker of Worlds, ends the show compressed into a cheerful penguin who marries a turtle and wears a crown, mostly because it makes him look like the one person who was ever kind to him. That pattern, villain after villain, quietly folded back into belonging rather than simply defeated and discarded, is doing enormous comfort work underneath the surface of the show, because it keeps insisting, gently and repeatedly, on a very specific worldview, that almost nothing and almost nobody is unsalvageable, that whatever darkness enters a person's life, whether through a cursed crown or a cosmic purpose older than time itself, there remains some path back towards something gentler, given enough patience and enough people willing to walk that path alongside you. A viewer curled up in the dark at the end of a hard day, quietly worried, as most tired people quietly are, about whether their own harder parts are permanent, is being told something specific and consistent by this show every single time a former villain gets welcomed back into the fold. No, probably not. Probably not permanent. Probably there's a way back. The same way there was for the Ice King. The same way there was for the Lich. The same way there was, eventually, for almost everyone this show ever let you worry about. Let's talk for a moment about the specific texture of the show's humor, because comedy is doing quote comfort work here too, in a way that's easy to overlook if you're only thinking about music and color and voice acting. Adventure Time's jokes are rarely cruel. There's very little humor in this show built on humiliation, on one character being made to look genuinely foolish for the amusement of the audience at their expense, the kind of comedy that leaves a faint aftertaste of unkindness even when it's funny in the moment. Instead, the show's comedy tends to be built on absurdity, on non sequitur, on characters simply being strange in ways that delight rather than mock. Jake's stretchy, shape-shifting antics, BMO's small, self-contained interior world, explored in episodes like the noir mystery Noir, Lumpy Space Princess's specific entitled cadence. All of it lands as funny without asking you to laugh at someone's expense. That matters for the same reason the color palette. Avoiding harsh contrast matters. Cruelty, even gentle cruelty, even cruelty clearly marked as a joke, activates something faintly defensive in a listener, a small flicker of social vigilance, because some part of every human brain is quietly tracking whether the group around it is currently a safe one or a dangerous one to be vulnerable inside of. A show built on affectionate absurdity rather than mockery never triggers that flicker. It lets you laugh with your guard all the way down, the specific kind of laughing that tired people trying to relax at the end of a long day, actually need, rather than the kind that leaves you slightly more alert than you were before the joke landed. It's worth pausing on BMO specifically for a moment, because BMO might be the single character in this entire show most purpose-built, whether or not anyone on the crew ever articulated it this way, to model unconditional presence. BMO doesn't have ambitions the way Princess Bubblegum does. BMO doesn't carry the weight of 1,000 years the way Marceline does. BMO is small and gentle and endlessly, patiently there, referring to Finn and Jake as their parents with complete sincerity despite technically being a video game console, gender left deliberately, permanently unresolved by the show itself. Different characters using different pronouns without the text ever settling the question. Voice actor Nikki Yang, who also voices Lady Rainicorn, describing BMO in some contexts as rid male, while the show's own dialogue never confirms it either way. That refusal to resolve, treated by the show not as an oversight, but as a real, considered choice, ends up being its own quiet act of comfort, because it means BMO belongs, without qualification, to everyone watching regardless of how they see themselves. There is no viewer BMO was built to exclude. And in the 5th season episode Noir, when BMO goes on a small, solitary, self-directed noir mystery adventure entirely inside their own imagination, casting inanimate objects and passing insects as characters in a story only BMO is telling, the show treats that inner life not as evidence of malfunction, but as evidence of a genuinely rich, self-sustaining interior world, one that doesn't need outside validation to be real or worthwhile. There is something deeply reassuring, if you let yourself sit with it, in watching a small, socially unassuming character be shown, without irony, to have a whole private universe running quietly inside them that nobody else even suspected. It suggests, gently, that the same might be true of you, that whatever quiet, private, unnoticed interior world you're carrying around tonight, the one nobody at your job or in your family fully sees, is not lesser for being unwitnessed. BMO's world was real the whole time. Yours probably is too. There's a broader observation buried in all of this that's worth naming plainly before we start moving toward the end of tonight's exploration, because it ties several of these threads together into something closer to a single idea. Almost every comfort mechanism we've talked about tonight, the imperfect audio, the painterly backgrounds, the warm chiptune scoring, the ensemble recording chemistry, the reliable home bass, the found family, the gently delivered grief, the redeemed villains, the affectionate rather than cruel humor, shares one underlying quality. They are all, in their own way, expressions of attention. Someone paid close attention to how a recording should sound and chose warmth over cleanliness. Someone paid close attention to how a background should look and chose texture over flatness. Someone paid close attention to how a recording session should feel for the actors inside it and chose togetherness over efficiency. Someone paid close attention to how grief should be delivered to an audience and chose gentleness over shock. None of that attention was owed to anyone. Nobody would have punished the production for choosing the cleaner, flatter, more efficient, more sensational version of any of those decisions. Plenty of other shows made exactly those choices, quarter after quarter, season after season, and did perfectly fine by most ordinary industry measures of success. Adventure Time simply, consistently, chose the version that required more care to produce over and over across 10 years and hundreds of episodes and dozens of collaborators who, by every account we have, mostly liked each other and liked the thing they were building together. And a viewer, watching the finished result, can feel that accumulated attention even without ever being able to name a single specific source of it. The same way you can walk into a home and simply feel in your body that it was lived in with care long before you've consciously registered a single detail that told you so. That feeling, multiplied across a whole world and 10 years of episodes and a genuinely enormous number of small, careful choices, is very possibly the actual, complete answer to tonight's question. Adventure Time feels comforting because an unusually large number of people across an unusually long stretch of time kept choosing to make it with care rather than merely with competence. And care, it turns out, is legible. It travels. It survives the trip from a recording booth in Burbank to a dark bedroom on the other side of the world, fully intact, and it lands, eventually, as exactly what it always was. Someone, a long time ago, choosing to be gentle with something, for no reason except that gentleness seemed like the right way to make it. There's another quality worth noticing before we get any further, one that has to do with how the show handles the simple passage of time inside a single episode, moment to moment, shot to shot, because pacing is one of those things almost nobody consciously watches for and almost everybody unconsciously feels. A lot of contemporary animation, especially the kind aimed at younger audiences, is built around near constant motion, cuts arriving every second or two, characters rarely still, backgrounds rarely allowed to simply exist on screen without something moving across them, because rapid, unbroken stimulation is a reliable, well-understood way to hold a child's attention. Adventure Time, for all its energy and all its jokes, is willing to let a shot breathe in a way that a lot of its contemporaries weren't. There are moments scattered across the show. A wide shot of the tree fort at dusk, held a beat longer than strictly necessary. A slow pan across a field before anything happens in it. Finn and Jake simply walking somewhere with nothing being said, where the show trusts silence and stillness enough to let them exist unfilled. Those pauses are small, individually. An extra second here, an extra 2 seconds there. But across an 11-minute episode and across hundreds of episodes, that accumulated willingness to let nothing happen for a moment, to let a background simply be looked at, to let two characters walk in silence rather than filling every second with dialogue, trains a viewer's nervous system toward a specific expectation. That stillness in this show is safe. Nothing bad tends to happen during the quiet parts. The quiet parts are simply quiet. That might sound like an unremarkable thing for a piece of media to teach you, but it isn't, particularly not for anyone whose day-to-day life has trained them, through work or stress or simple modern overstimulation, to associate any lull in activity with an oncoming demand for attention, a notification, a next task, a next crisis. A show that keeps proving, gently, over and over, that its quiet moments are genuinely quiet, with nothing hiding inside them waiting to demand something from you, becomes a small, reliable rehearsal space for a skill a lot of tired adults have half forgotten. The skill of simply being somewhere without bracing for what comes next. That willingness to slow down shows up even more clearly in the show's handling of sound effects, which almost never carry the sharp, percussive, attention-grabbing quality you'd expect from a show ostensibly aimed at keeping children engaged. A sword swing in Adventure Time rarely sounds like a blade in an action movie. It tends to carry a slightly cartoonish, rounded, almost squishy quality that reads as playful rather than dangerous. Explosions, and there are a fair number of them across the show's run, are rendered with the same soft-edged sensibility as everything else, closer to a comic pop than to anything that would genuinely startle a nervous system already primed for rest. Even moments of real peril tend to be scored and sound designed in a way that keeps the audio register gentle, favoring low, warm tones over the sharp, high-frequency stingers that horror and action media typically use specifically because they're known to spike a listener's alertness. This is, again, a decision, not an absence of decision. Somebody, working out the sound design for a given episode, chose the rounder, softer version of a sword clash over the sharper one every single time, across a decade of episodes, and the cumulative effect of that choice, repeated at that scale, is a soundscape that essentially never punishes a relaxed listener for staying relaxed. You can let your guard all the way down around this show's audio in a way you genuinely cannot around most action-adjacent media, because it has never once, across its entire run, used a jump scare of sound the way so much other content does as a matter of routine. It's worth pausing, too, on what happened to all of this care after the original series technically ended in 2018, because Comfort built this specifically into a production's culture doesn't necessarily survive a change in format, a change in team, or a jump to a new streaming platform. And the fact that it largely did survive here says something important about how deeply embedded it had become. The Distant Lands specials, which began airing on HBO Max in June of 2020, took some of the show's most beloved side characters, BMO, Marceline, and Princess Bubblegum, Finn and Jake themselves, and gave each of them a longer, more spacious, 45 to 50-minute format to explore stories the original 11-minute structure had never had room for. The Marceline and Bubblegum special, Obsidian, finally gave the audience the specific, plainly stated history behind the falling out that had shadowed their relationship for the entire original series, treating it not as a twist to be sensationalized, but as an ordinary human kind of loss. Two people who should have stayed close, drifting apart for reasons that felt enormous at the time, and smaller in retrospect, the way most real relationship ruptures eventually do. The special centered on Finn and Jake, together again, took on the genuinely difficult task of showing the two of them reunited after Jake's death, shifting its visual language into something more abstract and dreamlike for the afterlife sequences, and still managing to treat that reunion as something closer to joy than to grief, without ever pretending the loss underneath it hadn't been real. None of that emotional care was guaranteed simply because the same characters were involved. Plenty of franchise extensions lose the specific texture that made the original special, chasing spectacle or fan service, instead of the quieter qualities that actually built the audience's trust in the first place. Distant Lands, by most accounts, didn't lose it. The same instinct toward gentleness that shaped the original series carried directly into a wholly new format at a different studio on a different platform years after Pendleton Ward himself had stepped back from day-to-day involvement. The spin-off series Fiona and Cake pushed that continuity even further, taking what had spent the entire original run functioning as a running joke, the Ice King's own amateur fan fiction about gender-swapped versions of Finn and Jake, and revealing it, within the show's own internal logic, to have been real all along, an entire hidden universe that existed inside Simon Petrikov's damaged mind, protected there without his conscious knowledge, born out of the same loneliness that had made him write those stories in the first place. That reveal does something quietly remarkable to everything the audience thought it understood about comfort, creativity, and coping, because it suggests that even Simon's most ridiculed, most dismissed creative habit, a habit the original show mostly played for laughs, was never actually meaningless. It was, this whole time, an act of care so real it had accidentally generated an entire universe. There is something worth sitting with in that, on a night like tonight, if you happen to be the kind of person who makes small things, stories, drawings, songs, videos like the one you're listening to right now, mostly for your own comfort, without much expectation that they matter to anyone beyond yourself. Adventure Time's own mythology, by the time it reaches its spin-off era, has quietly built an argument that the things you make out of loneliness and love, even the ones you yourself think of as minor or embarrassing, might be more real and more valuable than you currently believe them to be. There's a strange, almost circular detail worth mentioning here too, because it says something about how thoroughly this show's specific brand of gentleness has become recognized, publicly and explicitly, as exactly the kind of thing people reach for at night. Searches for exactly this topic, why Adventure Time feels comforting, why people fall asleep to it, now return other long-form videos built around the same premise this one is built around. Other creators noticing the same pattern, reaching for the same explanation, drawn by the same late-night audience looking for the same thing. That's not a coincidence, and it's not really even a competition between one video and another. It's evidence that the specific comfort this show produces is real enough and recognized widely enough that an entire small ecosystem of content now exists purely to try to explain it, the same way a genuinely good, well-loved recipe eventually accumulates dozens of independent people trying to write down why it tastes the way it does. Nobody needed to coordinate that. The show simply did its work well enough, consistently enough for long enough, that a whole community of viewers, independently, arrived at the same conclusion. This, specifically, is where I go when I need to feel safe enough to stop thinking for a while. That brings us to a question worth asking directly, rather than only implying, because we've spent a lot of time tonight on how the show produces comfort and comparatively little time on why so many of the people reaching for it are adults rather than the children it was ostensibly made for. Part of the answer is simple nostalgia, and it would be dishonest to pretend nostalgia isn't doing real work here. Researchers who study comfort viewing describe nostalgia as something considerably more substantial than simple reminiscing, a genuine emotional state capable of measurably improving mood, strengthening a sense of meaning and belonging, and even, according to some of the research summarized in general audience coverage of the topic, boosting self-esteem by reconnecting a person to a version of their own life that felt simpler, safer, or more stable than their present circumstances currently do. Behavioral scientist Clarissa Silva, discussing why people reach for familiar shows rather than new ones, has framed the appeal plainly. The daily grind is mentally exhausting, and nostalgic media offers an escape rather than another demand on an already depleted mind. For a lot of viewers now in their 20s, 30s, and beyond, Adventure Time occupies exactly that role, a show first encountered during childhood or adolescence, now revisited during adulthood, specifically because it once belonged to an easier stretch of life, and returning to it offers a kind of time travel that costs nothing and asks nothing in return. But nostalgia alone doesn't fully explain why this particular show, rather than any of a dozen other childhood favorites a given viewer might have, ends up specifically functioning as sleep content for so many people. Plenty of nostalgic shows exist. Comparatively few of them get used this way, specifically, this consistently, by this many unrelated people who never coordinated with each other about it. The missing piece is everything we spent the earlier part of tonight walking through: the low emotional cost of entry, the near total absence of the kind of unresolved dread that keeps a tired mind working overtime, the gentle sound design, the painterly softness, the reliable return to home, the grief that always arrives, already survived. Nostalgia gets you back in the door, gently, the way an old familiar smell can pull you back into a room you haven't stood in for years. The show's actual construction is what lets you stay relaxed once you're there, rather than simply visiting for a moment before the spell wears thin. A person could feel nostalgic about a show that was otherwise loud, chaotic, and stressful to actually watch, and that nostalgia alone wouldn't be enough to make the show function as something to fall asleep to. It would just be a fond memory attached to something you'd rather revisit during the day, wide awake, with your guard up. Adventure Time gets to occupy both roles, the fond memory and the safe nighttime companion, because the nostalgia and the actual moment-to-moment experience of watching happen to reinforce each other rather than pulling in opposite directions. The version of the show you remember loving as a kid and the version currently playing on the screen in front of you turn out, on rewatch, to be built from the same gentle material the whole time. Nothing about revisiting it requires you to reconcile a fond memory with a rougher present reality. The two line up cleanly, and that alignment is itself part of the relief. There's a specific thematic echo worth drawing out here, one that connects the very first thing we talked about tonight, the typing audible under the theme song, to something much larger the show does with the idea of imperfect recordings across its entire run, because once you notice this pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. Simon Petrikov's VHS tapes, the recordings he made of himself in the last stretch of time before the crown fully consumed his old identity, are themselves imperfect artifacts in exactly the same register as that theme song. They're grainy. The framing is a little off. His voice catches sometimes. He fumbles a joke that doesn't land the way jokes are supposed to land, because the situation he's documenting is too bleak for humor to fully do its job, and the show lets that failed joke sit there, unedited, unsmoothed over, because the imperfection of the attempt is what makes it land emotionally, even though it doesn't land as comedy. Marceline's own recordings of memory, the notes she keeps, the songs she half remembers and half invents, carry that same grainy, imperfect quality. She doesn't have a clean, complete account of who Simon was, just fragments, scraps of paper, a stuffed bear, a handful of phrases she's carried and slightly worn down through 1,000 years of repetition, the way any memory, held long enough, eventually softens at the edges, the way a stone softens in a river. The show seems to understand, at a level deeper than any single decision about sound design, that the imperfect version of a memory, a recording, a performance, is very often the truer one, or at least the more honest one, because it hasn't been cleaned up to the point of losing the texture of the actual moment it came from. A perfectly smooth account of Simon Petrikov's decline would tell you the facts. The stammering, self-aware, quietly frightened man on those tapes tells you something a smooth account never could, because the imperfection itself is evidence of a real person, still present, still trying, right up until the point where trying stopped being possible. That is, in miniature, the exact same argument Pendleton Ward made when he chose to keep the typing under the theme song instead of the cleaner replacement recording. Grain is not a flaw to be corrected. Grain is often the last visible trace of an actual, specific, unrepeatable moment when something real was happening, and a show built by people who understood that instinctively, consistently, at every level, from a 30-second theme song to a 1,000-year love story, was never going to feel manufactured, no matter how many artists and writers and animators eventually passed through its production over the years. It's worth thinking, too, about how the show renders night itself, since so much of tonight's conversation has been about a piece of media specifically suited to being watched after dark, and it turns out Adventure Time has quietest, gentlest visual instincts precisely when the sun is down inside the story itself. Nighttime sequences in the show tend to lean into deep, warm blues and purples, rather than the flatter black most animation defaults to for darkness, the land of ooze sky at night, rendered with the same painterly attention as its daytime scenes, stars sometimes visible as soft, slightly imprecise points of light rather than crisp digital pinpricks, moonlight falling across the candy fields and grasslands in washes of color rather than harsh, contrasty shadow. Marceline's Cave, one of the show's most frequently revisited nighttime locations, is lit almost entirely by warm, low sources, candles, her own bioluminescent glow when she chooses to use it, the soft ambient light of whatever she happens to be watching on her television, and the show lingers there often enough, across enough episodes, that the space starts to feel genuinely lived in rather than simply visited for plot purposes. There's something almost uncanny about how well suited that specific visual register turns out to be for actual nighttime viewing, a show whose fictional night looks the way you might wish your own late hours felt, soft-edged, warmly lit, populated by people who are whatever their day held, safe and unhurried once the sun goes down. Watching Adventure Time at night means watching a world that is, quite often, also experiencing night at the same time you are, its own characters winding down, gathering in small warm rooms, playing music, talking quietly, doing precisely the kind of low-key, undemanding things a tired person does at the end of a long day. There's a subtle, almost mirror-like comfort in that alignment, watching a fictional world settle into its own evening while you settle into yours, the two nights running quietly parallel to each other for as long as the episode lasts. None of this, it's worth repeating one more time before we move toward closing, was engineered as a deliberate strategy to capture a specific viewing demographic. Nobody in the writer's room, so far as any available account of the show's production suggests, sat down and said, "Let's build this specifically for insomniacs." What happened instead, across 10 years and hundreds of episodes and dozens of directors and writers and artists rotating through the production, most of them young, most of them fresh out of the same handful of art schools, most of them clearly enjoying the specific, strange, hybrid creative freedom Cartoon Network extended to this particular show during this particular stretch of its history, was simpler and, in its way, more moving. A group of people who liked each other and who were given an unusual amount of latitude to make something the way they personally wanted to make it, kept choosing warmth over efficiency, texture over polish, gentleness over shock, presence over performance, at nearly every decision point across a full decade of work. And the compounding result of all those individually small, individually unremarkable choices turned out to be a piece of media so thoroughly, structurally kind that it has become, entirely without any marketing department's help, one of the most reliable sources of manufactured peace an anxious mind can find at 2 in the morning anywhere on the internet. That's not something you can fully plan for. It's something you can only really arrive at by accident, through years of people simply being decent to each other and to the thing they were building, and trusting that decency would eventually show up, intact on the other end, in the body of someone they would never meet, lying in the dark, finally exhaling. There's one more character-level source of comfort worth naming specifically, because it addresses something most media aimed at any audience, adult or child, tends to avoid almost entirely: the plain fact that everyone eventually dies. Jake stands out among the show's major characters as someone who seems to have made a genuine, settled peace with his own mortality long before the show ever confirms, through material released after the main series ended, that he does in fact die at some point following the events of the finale. That peace shows up in small, almost throwaway moments rather than grand philosophical speeches. In the episode Dungeon Train, a vision briefly shows an aged version of Jake, his muzzle gone white, his movements slower, still recognizably himself, and the show doesn't frame that vision as a horror to be avoided or a tragedy to be mourned in advance. Jake simply looks at it, absorbs it, and keeps going, the same way he absorbs almost everything else that happens to him, with an easy, curious, largely unbothered acceptance. He talks, occasionally, and without much elaboration, about a rougher period in his own past, hints at a life before the show's timeline that wasn't always defined by the warmth he brings to everything now, suggesting that his current ease wasn't necessarily his starting point so much as something he found his way toward. And his relationship with time in general runs differently from every human character around him. He experiences his own children's entire childhoods, from infancy to adulthood, compressed into a matter of days, because of their mixed magical parentage, and rather than being destabilized by watching an entire generation grow up and move out in what amounts to a single long weekend, he simply adapts, present for each stage as it comes, unhurried by how quickly the stages arrive. There's something quietly instructive in watching a character move through both accelerated time and eventual mortality with that same unbothered presence, especially for anyone watching late at night who might, if they're honest with themselves, be carrying some version of ordinary human dread about their own limited time, about people they love aging, about a life that keeps moving faster than they feel prepared for. Jake doesn't offer an argument against that dread. He simply demonstrates, episode after episode, an alternative way of standing inside the same basic facts of impermanence that everyone eventually has to stand inside, one built on presence and curiosity rather than avoidance or despair. He was, as one especially direct piece of writing about the character has put it, simply gifted at being alive, not at everything, not even at most things, but at the specific, underrated skill of finding the part of a day that was worth appreciating and staying there for a while. A show that models that skill this consistently through a character this beloved ends up quietly teaching it to an audience that might never have encountered it, modeled quite this gently anywhere else. There's a visual pattern worth naming too, one that recurs often enough across the show's run that it starts to feel almost like a signature, a specific image the show keeps returning to without ever drawing explicit attention to the repetition. A character sitting alone in a space too large for one person, holding something together by themselves that would probably be easier to hold with help. The Ice King wandering his empty ice palace, built with rooms enough for a family he can no longer remember wanting. Marceline in her cave with her bass, working through centuries of accumulated loss, the only way she's found jazz that actually helps, one song at a time. Princess Bubblegum in her laboratory, at hours when the rest of her kingdom is asleep, still solving something, still building something, because building has become the only language she fully trusts for processing whatever it is she's actually feeling. The show returns to this image often enough, across enough different characters, that it starts to function less like a coincidence and more like an honest, recurring observation about what loneliness actually tends to look like from the outside. Not always dramatic, not always visibly tragic, often just a person quietly occupied in a space slightly too big for the amount of company currently inside it. And the crucial thing the show does with that recurring image every single time is resist the temptation to treat it as a permanent condition. Every character who gets shown alone in that specific way eventually, across the show's long run, makes some kind of movement back toward other people, imperfectly, slowly, sometimes taking years of in-show time and multiple full seasons of real time to get there, but always eventually moving. The show never suggests that loneliness is a character flaw or a failure of will. It suggests, gently and repeatedly, that loneliness is simply what tends to happen when the world moves faster than the connections capable of making it feel bearable, and that the honest, appropriate response isn't shame at having ended up alone in a room too big for you. It's movement, whenever movement becomes possible, back toward whoever might be willing to help fill the space. For a viewer watching this late at night, possibly the only person currently awake in an entire house or apartment, possibly carrying some version of that same too big room, there's a specific, unforced comfort in watching a whole ensemble of characters be shown over and over, moving eventually toward connection, rather than being condemned to stay exactly where loneliness first found them. The show never rushes that movement, and it never pretends the movement is easy. It simply keeps insisting, patiently, across 10 years of episodes, that the movement stays possible for every single character it ever shows you sitting alone in the dark. There's a last piece of this worth naming before we head toward the ending, and it has less to do with the show itself than with what happens on the other side of the screen in whatever room you happen to be lying in right now. Comfort media, by most of the research we touched on earlier tonight, doesn't only work because of what's inside it. It works because of the ritual built up around watching it. The specific ordinary habits a person develops over months or years of returning to the same well-worn source of ease. Maybe you always watch with the lights off completely. Maybe there's a specific blanket, a specific side of the bed, a specific volume the show has to be set to before it actually starts working the way it's supposed to. Maybe you've built, without ever deciding to, a whole small ritual around this show that has almost nothing to do with plot or character and everything to do with the simple, repeated act of arriving at the same kind of ease, the same way, often enough that your body now recognizes the shape of the ritual before the first line of dialogue even plays. That's not a lesser form of engagement with a piece of art. It might be the most honest form there is, closer to how people have always related to lullabies and bedtime stories and the specific, worn passages of a favorite book read one more time before sleep. Less about discovering something new and more about being returned, reliably, to a state you already know and trust. The small request scattered through videos like this one, asking you to leave a comment, naming where you are and what time it is where you're lying, is really a version of that same ritual, dressed up as something interactive. It isn't really about the information. Nobody watching tonight particularly needs to know that somebody else, somewhere on the other side of an ocean, is also awake right now, also looking for the same kind of quiet. But there's something oddly grounding about it anyway, about scrolling down after an episode or a video like this one and finding a small, scattered collection of times and places, 2 in the morning in one country, 11 at night in another, someone's early evening on a different continent entirely, and realizing that this specific, private, slightly embarrassing thing you're doing right now, using an old cartoon about a boy and his dog to talk your own nervous system down from a day that was too loud, is being done right now by strangers you'll never meet, in places you'll probably never see. All of you reaching for the exact same kind of company at slightly different points in the same rotating night. It's a small, low-effort form of belonging, but it's a real one, and it fits neatly into everything the show itself has spent 10 seasons quietly arguing, that you were never actually as alone in whatever room you're sitting in as it sometimes feels. That's most of the shape of it then, at least as far as I've been able to trace it, layer by layer, tonight. It's worth saying boundly before we close that a good amount of what we've walked through carries a certain amount of interpretation alongside its facts, and it's worth being honest about which is which. The recording dates, the composers, the art directors, the specific choice to keep the temp track under the theme song, the ensemble recording setup, the actors' own public comments about how the process felt to them, all of that comes from documented interviews, official credits, and the show's own well-established production history. The deeper claims about why any of that specifically produces the particular feeling of safety so many viewers report, about the psychology of grain versus polish, about what a viewer's nervous system is actually doing while watching a quiet scene unfold, draw on general research into comfort media and nostalgia rather than anything Adventure Time's own production ever stated directly as intent. Nobody on the crew, so far as any available record shows, ever sat down and explicitly designed an episode to lower a viewer's heart rate. That particular thread, connecting the specific choices to the specific feeling they produce, is my own reading of the evidence, offered on us honestly as a reading rather than as something the show's creators ever confirmed in so many words. I think it holds up. I think if you go back and rewatch even a single, quiet, ordinary episode with everything we've talked about tonight in mind, you'll start noticing the same small choices I've been pointing at: the grain, the painted light, the easy chemistry, the gentleness of the sound. But it's fair and it's honest to say plainly that the connection between those choices and the specific comfort they produce in you is something we've been building together tonight, out of the available evidence, rather than something the show ever announced about itself. Let's sit for a moment longer with the finale, because even the way the show chose to end itself carries this same fingerprint. Come along with me. The episode that closes out the original 10-season run brings together nearly every character the show ever introduced across a battle against an entity of pure chaos, vast and strange enough to unmake anything that enters it. And yet the emotional center of that finale isn't the battle at all. It's Simon Petrikov, stripped at last of the crown that stole 1,000 years from him, standing inside that chaos as simply, finally, himself again, next to Betty, the woman who crossed centuries to save him. It's Marceline and Princess Bubblegum, after seasons of circling each other, finally kissing, plainly, without ambiguity, in front of everyone. It's the show choosing, at the very last possible moment it had, to spend its remaining time not on spectacle, but on tenderness, on letting its most patient, longest-running emotional threads finally, quietly resolve. Even here, at the end, with every excuse in the world to go bigger and louder, the show chose smaller and warmer instead. That choice, consistent all the way to the final frame, is the same choice it made with the theme song's typing, and the same choice it made with the painted backgrounds, and the same choice it made letting its actors record together in a room. Given the option between impressive and gentle, Adventure Time almost always, across its entire decade of existence, chose gentle and trusted that gentle would turn out to be the more lasting kind of impressive after all. Think, for a moment, about how differently that finale could have gone, given everything the show had built up to that point. It had a genuine cosmic scale antagonist available to it, an entity old enough and strange enough to justify almost any amount of spectacle a production team wanted to throw at a series finale. It had 10 years of accumulated mythology, dozens of powerful beings, entire unresolved threads about the nature of the universe itself, more than enough material to build an ending that prioritized scale over intimacy, the kind of finale built primarily to be impressive rather than felt. And it flirted with that scale, briefly, visually, the way a finale probably has to. But it kept steering itself back toward the small, human center of the whole story. An old man getting his name back. Two people who loved each other for years finally saying so out loud. A found family standing together in whatever was left of the wreckage. Unhurried, unbothered by how modest that image might look next to the size of the threat they just survived. That's a genuinely unusual instinct for a piece of television to have at the exact moment it's trying to send an audience off for good. And it says something true about where the show's actual priorities sat the entire time, underneath all 10 years of jokes and adventures and cosmic lore. The lore was never really the point. The lore was the scaffolding the show built so it would have somewhere to hang the actual point, which was always people choosing each other, imperfectly, patiently, across however much time it took. It was right to trust that gentleness would last. People are still watching, right now, tonight, all over the world, at every hour the clock can produce, precisely because gentle turned out to be the thing that lasts, long after louder, flashier, more impressive-looking shows from the same era have quietly faded out of most people's rotation. Nobody is falling asleep to spectacle. Spectacle asks something of you, some amount of continued alertness, some willingness to be impressed, and impressed is not a restful state to be in. Gentle asks nothing. Gentle simply keeps you company, while whatever it is you're carrying tonight slowly loosens its grip, and that, more than any single clever plot twist or any single beautifully rendered background, might be the actual, complete reason this specific show, out of all the shows that could have filled this role, ended up being the one so many people quietly, privately, without much fanfare, decided to trust with their nights. That's most of the shape of it, the specific mechanics underneath a feeling that, for a long time, probably just seemed like magic to you, the way it seemed like magic to me before I started paying close enough attention to notice all the small human decisions holding it up. The typing under the ukulele, the grain left in on purpose, the painted light, the chiptune warmth, the actors laughing together in a booth in Burbank for close to a decade, the home base that never stops being home, the grief that arrives already survived, the villains who get let back in, the jokes that never punch down. A gender left open on purpose so nobody watching would ever feel like the show had already decided they didn't belong inside it. None of it was random, and none of it, taken piece by piece, is even especially rare or expensive to produce. What's rare is doing all of it, consistently, for 10 years, without ever once trading it away for something flashier. That consistency, more than any single choice, is the real architecture of the comfort you've probably felt from this show for years without quite knowing where it came from. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with me through all of it. If any of this helped tonight, even a little, consider leaving a like on your way out. And if you'd like more of this, more long, slow evenings spent taking apart exactly why the things we love feel the way they feel, consider subscribing so the next one finds you when you need it. Wherever you are, whatever time it is where you're lying right now, I hope the land of Ooh and everything quietly holding it together gives you the kind of rest it was built, one small, careful choice at a time, to give. One last thought, and then I really will let the quiet take over. Whatever brought you here tonight, a hard day, a mind that wouldn't settle, plain curiosity about a show you loved a long time ago and never quite stopped loving, you didn't stumble onto this by accident. Something in you already knew, probably long before you could have explained it, the way we just spent the last while explaining it together, that this particular world was safe enough to rest inside. That instinct was right. It was right the first time you ever felt it, watching this show as a kid, without any of this vocabulary for why it worked, and it's still right now, years later, with all the vocabulary in the world laid out in front of you. You don't need to remember any of the specific facts we covered tonight. The composers' names, the art director's history, the exact season a particular episode aired in, the specific episode where a snail wandered through the background for an entire year before anyone knew what it really was, for any of this to keep working on you the next time you need it to. The comfort was never really located in the facts. It was located in the care underneath them, and that care is still there, waiting every single time you press play, whether or not you're thinking about any of this at all. Sleep well.